In a world that's becoming increasingly more digital, it's more important now than ever for children and adults alike to step away from our screens and our often chaotic world, and to find adventure in the pages of a fresh new book. To join us as we venture into the House on Hoarder Hill by Mickey Lish and Kelly Nye. So, find a quiet place and get ready to let your imagination run wild as we embark on a story of magic, hope, and danger. The stone raven dreamt of flying. She dreamt of rising on currents of warm air and chasing other smaller birds, of swooping into the woods hungry for a catch. But this pleasant dream was interrupted by a voice. "Help them," it said. "Help them find their way." It was the voice of the missing one. The missing one was never seen, but the raven had heard the voice before. It belonged to the great house somehow. Help who? And how? The raven thought back. What can I do stuck here on the roof? I can only dream of flying after all. And then she felt it. Freedom, the glorious freedom to move. It began with a tingle at the top of her small head and spread as though poured like water over her carved body. White stone turned to feather, muscle, a beating heart and darting eyes. The raven shook her wings out in delight, then launched into the air, no longer dreaming but truly in flight. She arched high above the great house in joyful loops, ignoring the envious calls of the stone gargoyles and dragon grotesques still fixed to the roofline. "Please find them and lead them here," said the voice of the missing one. "Who?" asked the raven, surveying the land beneath her. The missing one showed the raven a vision of a flock of humans in a red car. A girl, a boy, a woman and a man. "Family," whispered the missing one. The raven set off to find them.
Hello, I'm Jenny Richardson. I'm going to be reading chapter 1 of The House on Hoarder Hill. They are just tricks. A ball of gloom was growing in Hetty Van Beer's chest as she stared out the car window at the snow-covered fields. With every mile she was close to what was sure to be the most boring 2 weeks ever. It was so unfair of her parents, both archaeologists, to go on a dig in Spain without them. Well, perhaps it was sensible to leave Spencer behind. He was only 8. But Hetty was 11, a guide, and had already learnt a few Spanish phrases from a language app. "Will you come back early if there's an emergency?" she asked. "What kind of emergency?" asked Dad. He was in the middle of choosing another song for the stereo while Mum was driving. "Say if Spencer's finger got cut off." Spencer looked up from his book of magic tricks. "Grandpa John's a magician. He'd be able to stick it back on with magic." Hetty shook her head. "You're so gullible." "What does gullible mean?" "It means you believe anything. Anyway, he's not a magician anymore, so don't expect anything interesting." Hetty leant forwards until her face was in between the 2 front seats. "So, would you come back early if Spencer's finger got cut off? Since magic isn't real?" "It depends which finger," said Dad. Mum smothered a laugh. "Of course we would." She reached back to pat Hetty's cheek. "But try not to create any emergencies, okay? This trip is very important to Dad and me. It can mean a lot of new work for us. Then I promise you, me, Spence and Dad on other trips." Other trips. As the fields and trees and hills whizzed by, Hetty put her headphones on, cuddled into her mum's stripy scarf, and imagined herself in Egypt, gazing up at the Great Pyramids and the Sphinx. But out of the corner of her eye, she noticed Dad glancing at her to see if she was listening to them. When he turned back around, she hit pause on her music, suspecting he might be about to say something interesting. "They'll be okay with him, won't they?" Dad was asking softly. "Of course," Mum said. "He may be preoccupied and funny about things, but he wouldn't let any harm come to them." Isn't this the time of year your mother... Dad trailed off with a sympathetic look. Mum sighed. It'll be good for him to have some company here. He never stays long when he visits us. At long last, their little red car stopped in the centre of Marbury's Rest. It was a sleepy, higgledy-piggledy village, dotted with only a few small shops, although it had the feel of a place that never changed. Hetty's family were confused by the five-way junction at its centre every single time. Why can I never remember the street? Mum muttered. Give me a second, Dad said, as he tried to get the map working on his phone. Spencer had exhausted his pocket's usual stockpile of lollies and started munching the last of his cheese sandwiches, as though he thought they would be there for a while. Hetty spotted a large white bird circling overhead. Now it came flapping towards them. Is that a white raven? She breathed. Closer and closer it flew, until to everyone's shock it landed on the bonnet of the car. It was enormous, even bigger than the ones Hetty had seen at the Tower of London. It tilted its head to the side as though sizing them up, and then cawed. With a lazy flap, it took off. Down one of the narrow streets. They all stared. Mum seemed frozen to her seat, too surprised to move. The raven circled back and landed on the bonnet of the car again. It hopped close to the windscreen and gave Mum a stern look, then propelled itself down the same narrow street once more. Hetty had a funny, thrilled feeling where her ball of gloom had been. It's like it wants us to follow it, she said. Oh, I don't know about that, Mum said. But I think it's the right street. She put the car in gear and they followed the raven all the way back to Grandpa John's house. Although they hadn't visited in a long while, the house was exactly as Hetty remembered. 3 floors of stone, with a dark roof rising steeply into the sky. On the roof were carved stone creatures, and a short tower, which Mum called a belvedere, and was built to shut off the view, but which Hetty thought was a turret from which you could watch the enemy approach. Nestled deep in the shadowy porch was the black front door. The garden behind a wrought iron fence was strewn with leaves and snow. There was none of the hustle-bustle of their own home and the homes of Hetty's friends, but it wasn't unfriendly. It was more like Grandpa John's house was taking a long time to think before it started speaking. The white raven that had led them here, Hetty was sure it had been leading them, flew up to the roof and settled up there amongst the other small statues that were more fantastical, like dragons and griffins. Hetty gave Spencer a nudge and pointed. At one of the windows on the top floor stood Grandpa John, his white hair sticking up in untidy crests. His face crinkled into a smile, and he stepped back from the window, disappearing from sight. At the very next moment, faster than anyone could cover that distance, he was opening the heavy front door. Spencer's mouth popped open, and Hetty blinked in surprise. Grandpa John smoothed his hand down his shirt buttons, and then did a nimble turn all the way around to face them again. To their astonishment, he was now wearing a brightly coloured tie. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called, in his deep, warm voice, "welcome." The children crowded around Grandpa John to give him a hug. He smelled of peppermints and pipe smoke as always. Hetty secretly measured how tall she was, pleased to find she was now up to Grandpa's 3rd shirt button. "Grandpa," Spencer burst out immediately, "if I've got a finger that's cut off, can you stick it back on with magic?" Grandpa John lifted Spencer's hands to his face to study them. "All of your fingers appear to be attached. Why, you ask?" "Hetty doesn't believe in magic," said Spencer. "Well," he replied, "one might say that magic is a sensible thing not to believe in." Hetty was surprised. Grandpa John used to be a very famous magician. Grandpa John regarded Hetty for a long moment, then, as though wanting to say something but not able to find the words, "She looks like Mum, doesn't she?" Mum said, stepping up to join them. There was an awkward moment when neither she nor Grandpa John knew which cheek to kiss, or whether to simply hug. Grandpa John cleared his throat. More than ever. They were speaking of Hetty and Spencer's grandmother Rose, which hardly ever happened. She had disappeared when Hetty's mum was still a young child. Looking like Grandma Rose gave Hetty a small glow of satisfaction, until she realised that Grandpa John's eyes were shiny with tears. It made him miss her, Hetty thought. But before she could decide what to say next, Dad stacked the last of the bags and came to greet Grandpa John with a handshake. The moment to ask questions disappeared. The hallway seemed unchanged since the last visit 3 years ago. One wall was lined with sculpted heads and carved statues. On the opposite wall, over a hall table, hung 2 large paintings in gold frames. Hetty placed her new old phone, a hand-me-down from Dad, which he'd given her to use while they were away, on the edge of the table. Each painting was a portrait of a person with a human body, but the head of an animal. One was a skunk and the other a magpie. They were dressed in really old-fashioned clothes and had a strange collection of items. Jewellery, gloves, fruit, a small knife. Curiously, there were also modern objects in the paintings. A Rubik's Cube, a set of keys, and a CD of some band called the Smiths. "Look, my team!" Spencer pointed to a West Ham beanie, painted in the corner. He snapped a photo with the Polaroid camera he'd taken almost everywhere since his birthday. "I hope you kids don't mind sharing," Grandpa John was saying. "I'm afraid I haven't had time to clear out more than 1 bedroom. That got their attention. Hetty had a sinking feeling that this holiday was going to go from boring to downright annoying. "But, well, I have my own room at home," she said hopefully. "What's wrong with sharing a room with me?" huffed Spencer. Hetty rolled her eyes. "You smell like a monkey's bum." "That means you go around smelling monkeys' bums," Spencer cackled. "Hey!" Mum waggled a finger. "No fighting. You're sharing, and if you don't share nicely, you'll go on sharing when we get back home. Now, let's get these bags up to your room." With a sigh, Hetty picked up the phone and frowned. It was now at the back of the table, leaning against the painting of the skunk. The earphones almost stuck to the painting. Had Spencer moved it? "Come on, Hetty," called Dad from the stairs. "Don't forget to bring your pillow." Hetty checked her earphones for paint and found nothing, so she grabbed her things and scrambled after the others. "Why are the doors all different colours?" Spencer asked Grandpa John as he led the way up the stairs. "This was a bed and breakfast once upon a time," Grandpa John said. Perhaps it helped guests remember which room they were in. Their bedroom had a door that was faded mauve colour. 2 beds were already made up inside, and even though it felt very still, there was a fresh smell of lavender in the air. On the walls hung framed maps of all the continents, and plates painted with famous ancient structures from around the world, like the pyramids of Giza and the Great Wall of China. At the foot of each bed were large trunks, each one big enough for the children to hide in. Spencer bolted to the bed closest to the window. "This one's mine." "I'm going to the kitchen to make some tea with Grandpa," Mum said. "You guys come down when you've put your things away, okay? But don't touch anything on the way down," said Grandpa. "There are things here that are locked away for good reason. Do you understand?" Although they had heard this umpteen times on their way here, there was a note of warning in Grandpa John's voice that stilled the children. They nodded. "Yes, Grandpa." To unpack, Spencer stood inside his trunk and turned his bag upside down so that all the things fell in around him. His bag wasn't quite empty though, and when he lifted it up for a final shake, a sock full of marbles fell on his head. Hetty shook her head at her brother's messy ways. "Doesn't Grandpa have like 6 other bedrooms here?" she asked. "Why can't I have my own room?" "Grandpa's collected a lot of things over the years," Dad said, studying a battleship in a bottle. "The other rooms are probably full of stuff." Spencer's eyes lit up. "Does he collect stuff for his magic?" "They're just tricks, Spence," said Hetty. "Not real magic." "He doesn't do magician stuff anymore, Spencer," Dad said. "Not since Grandma disappeared," said Hetty. Dad was startled. "How did you know that?" "I heard you and Mum talking about it once. Her grandmother was so rarely brought up that Hetty listened keenly for any mention of her, even if she wasn't supposed to hear." "What's magic got to do with Grandma?" asked Spencer. Dad heaved a sigh. "I don't know, Spence. he said, although Hetty thought he knew more than he was saying. Come on, you've got a couple of weeks to ask him all these questions. I bet there'll be a few interesting stories for you to hear. The kitchen had a feeling of order that was different from the clutter of the rest of the house, as though someone else was in charge here. It was well scrubbed and airy, with windows overlooking the frosty back garden, and another door that led to the laundry. Grandpa John was at the oak table, with his cup of tea. He was rolling a couple of small steel balls through his fingers. Up, over and around they moved, as though they were dancing. Spencer hurried to Grandpa's side, in awe, eyes fixed on the steel balls. They flashed in the light, changing each other, around Grandpa John's wrists and palms, and then suddenly they were gone. Mum and Dad clapped. Grandpa John smiled at Spencer over his teacup. You said he doesn't do magic anymore, Spencer said to Hetty triumphantly. That wasn't magic, said Hetty. It was knowing to do cool stuff with your hands. Wasn't it, Grandpa? Indeed, said Grandpa John. No magic performed in this house. Strictly tricks only. He seemed to be reminding himself of a rule that mustn't be broken. Over thick wedges of lemon cake, Mum took Grandpa John through a page of instructions about Spencer's asthma, urged the children to wrap up, and reminded them for the 101st time not to touch Grandpa's things. And then it was time for their parents to go. All of a sudden, the ball of gloom sat right on top of Hetty's heart again. They hugged goodbye on the porch. And when Spencer and Mum started sniffing, Hetty found herself getting teary too. Even Dad looked a little red in around the eyes. Look after Spence, he whispered into Hetty's hair. And we'll be back on Christmas Eve. I will. Hetty saw their mum whisper something to Spencer that made him glance at Hetty, nod and put on a brave smile. The little red car coughed to life and the parents' arms waved out the windows until they turned the corner and were out of sight. What did Mum say to you? Hetty asked Spencer. Well, that I have to look after you, Spencer said, pulling on the furry aviator cap that Dad had given them before leaving. He reached out to take Grandpa John's hand. And we both have to look after Grandpa.
Chapter 2. A frame thick with dust. Hetty and Spencer helped Grandpa John wash the cups and plates, not yet knowing what else to do with themselves. Drying the forks, Hetty drifted over to the fridge, which was covered with a mass of magnets. Amongst the little Eiffel Tower from Paris, the miniature Statue of Liberty from New York, and tiny temples and castles were coloured letters, just like the ones Hetty and Spencer used to play with as little children. The letters spell out a message. Welcome to our home. Spencer came to see what she was looking at, as he often did. He used some of the other letters to spell out thank you. Grandpa, what's for dinner? He asked. Spence, snorted Hetty. We've only just had afternoon tea, you greedy guts. I'm not saying I'm hungry now. Grandpa John joined them at the fridge and yanked open the freezer. I'll have to see what Mrs. Willems has made. Who's Mrs. Willems? Asked Spencer. Oh, she does some housekeeping and cooking for me. He pulled 3 containers out, labelled Friday, Saturday and Monday. Which one would you like? He asked the children. You can each choose one. What's in them? Asked Spencer. Grandpa John looked sheepish. I don't really remember, actually. Today's Saturday, so I'll have Monday, said Spencer. It'll be like time travel. Hetty picked Saturday, which looked like a lasagna to her. Excellent, said Grandpa. I'll have Friday. Looks like a shepherd's pie. Setting the tubs on the worktop to thaw, he suddenly seemed lost. Well, now what shall we do? Do you have Wi-Fi, Grandpa? Asked Hetty. Why, what? Grandpa replied, puzzled. There was no internet here, no video games, no friends, no mobile phone signal. They explored the garden for a short while and found some unusual statues, but headed back inside when sleep began to fall. Grandpa tried to teach them a card game, but neither Hetty nor Spencer could get the hang of the rules. Spencer sunk further and further onto his arms, until he was very nearly head down on the table. The long, dull days began to stretch in front of Hetty, and she worried she hadn't brought enough books with her. So when the doorbell rang, Both children immediately sprang up in the hope of some exciting interruption. "What is it?" Grandpa John asked, puzzled. "The doorbell," they said. Grandpa John got to his feet, looking a little put out. Grumbling about his hearing, he stalked down the hallway. As he squinted through the peephole of the door, he snorted. "Oh, you old nosy Parker." "Who is it, Grandpa?" asked Spencer. Grandpa John winked at Spencer and turned the 4 locks of his front door to open it. On the porch stood a man with a grey beard and a wide smile. He was taller than Grandpa John and had a sizable round belly, but their eyes and noses were shaped alike. It was their great Uncle Peter, Grandpa John's brother. They were supposed to call him Uncle Peter because he once said the great made him feel old. "What are you doing here?" Grandpa John asked, without a proper greeting. "I came to see my family, you old glump," Uncle Peter boomed. "You missed Mum and Dad," Spencer piped up. "They've already left." "Oh, did I? I'm sorry. I was catching up with a dear old friend who loves to talk as much as I do. But I'm here now to say hello." He held his arms wide and swept both of the children into a hug. "I suppose you were wanting tea then?" Grandpa John sighed. "Oh, yes, please, old boy." As they followed Grandpa John back to the kitchen, Uncle Peter whispered, "I'm surprised your grandfather's letting you stay, considering how he hates people touching his things. I hope the spooky house didn't scare you." Hetty felt a jolt of loyalty to Grandpa John at that. "No, we think it's cool." "Well, I'm a little bit scared," confided Spencer. Uncle Peter nodded in understanding. More loudly, he said, "Anytime you want to come and stay, you just tell your grandfather. I'm only about half an hour away, although you think I live in the Arctic with a number of times John and I visit. And your cousins live with me. You haven't seen them since you were babies. A travesty, an absolute travesty. They're about your ages, actually." Hetty remembered her mum mentioning these cousins, a girl and a boy. "I want to learn magic tricks from Grandpa while I'm here," hinted Spencer. "Oh, I was a magician too in my day. Loads to teach you," said Uncle Peter. "More famous than you, wasn't I, John?" Grandpa John placed the teapot on the table, steam rising from its spout. "After I retired, perhaps." Then he thought for a moment. "No, not even then." Uncle Peter harumphed and stroked his beard. "It's time you met your cousins again, Angelica and Max. I told them you were staying here, and they were bursting to come and meet you." Hetty and Spencer looked at each other in hope. "Please, Grandpa, can they come over and stay?" asked Hetty. "What's more of you?" Grandpa protested. "Please." Grandpa pointed at Uncle Peter. "This is your fault, you know. We all set for a nice quiet time." "Pah," said Uncle Peter. "Where's the fun in that?" Uncle Peter stayed for an hour, chatting and joking with the children easily. He had a rather musical voice that was perfect for the stage, and which he used to impersonate magicians he'd known, including Grandpa John. Both Hetty and Spencer were disappointed when it was time to walk him to the front door. "I'll bring your cousins over in the next day or so," Uncle Peter promised, reaching for his hat on the wall table. Hetty was sure Uncle Peter had placed it with the rim down, but now it was turned over, like a bowl waiting to be filled. None of the others seemed to notice. Had she remembered it wrongly? There was something peculiar about this hall table, she decided. But before she could ask any questions, Uncle Peter hugged the children goodbye, hopped into his car with a wave, and zoomed down the hill. Grandpa John was in a strangely quiet mood during dinner. It drifted over the table like a fog, dampening any chatter by the children. Was he bothered by them being here? The near silence continued as they cleaned and dried the dishes, and Hetty was relieved when Grandpa suggested it was time for them to go to bed. "I wonder how long it would take to learn all of Uncle Peter's tricks," Spencer said as they padded down the hallway to their bedroom. "Years, I bet. I wonder how old Grandpa was when he started learning. Why don't you ask him?" Hetty noticed Spencer drawing closer and closer to her. "What are you doing?" "It's so much bigger here than home," said Spencer. I wish Grandpa would turn on more lights." "Don't be a scaredy cat." They passed the doorway to the room next to theirs. The door, and now faded dark green, was very slightly ajar. "Let's have a look in there," Hetty said softly. The door squeaked as she opened it. "Hetty!" "It's okay, Spencer, he won't hear." "Grandpa doesn't want us looking through his stuff." Hetty began edging into the room. "You stand guard." But Spence followed, bumping into her in his eagerness to stay close. I hate standing guard." The room was crammed from floor to ceiling. Towers of boxes looming over a bear rug on the floor. Shelves overflowing with books, clocks and strange brass devices Hetty didn't even recognise. Enormous glass jars holding dried plants and tiny bones, and a large stuffed deer head overlooking it all. Hanging nearby on the wall was a dusty metal contraption that looked like a large bundle of feathers. The feathers were as long as Hetty's forearm, some brass and some light dull steel, and folded down like a Chinese fan. She wondered what they unfurled to. Drifting closer to a shelf, Hetty couldn't help reaching out one finger towards a small but incredibly lifelike figurine of a Roman charioteer being pulled by 2 horses. His whip and the horses' manes and tails streamed in an imagined wind. As her finger made contact, she heard whispers of neighing and the thunder of hooves. Spencer gave her a hard nudge. "Don't touch!" Before Hetty could say anything, there was a heavy thump behind them. They spun around. "What was that?" Spencer asked in a panicked whisper. On the floor in the middle of the room lay a large leather-bound scrapbook. "Oh, it was just that scrapbook falling off the shelf," Hetty said, but her heart was beating like a drum. "How did it fall off?" asked Spencer. "We weren't anywhere near it." Hetty didn't answer. She knelt to pick up the book, and out fell a photograph of a woman who resembled their mother. She was dressed in a short outfit with fringing around the hem and silk top hat. Dressed like a magician's assistant. Spencer peered over her shoulder. "Who's that?" Was all Hetty said, although she had a strong feeling she knew who this was. And then, right beneath their feet, the floor seemed to ripple. A bump in the floorboards about the size of Hetty's fist moved in a meandering curve, slowly at first and then faster. "Ah!" yelped Spencer. Hetty shushed him. She didn't want to get caught in here, but the ripple in the floor was freaking her out too. They huddled together as it inched closer until, about half a metre away, the bump came to a stop beneath the dark brown knot in the wood. The bump flattened and disappeared so that the floorboard looked normal, except the knot in the wood squeezed in tight and then snapped out again, as though it were a blinking eye. Just then, they heard Grandpa John coming up the stairs to say goodnight. Hetty crammed the photograph into her pocket of her dressing gown. She grabbed Spencer by the hand and they ran. They were in their beds by the time Grandpa John walked into their room. Hetty's thudding heart slowly calmed as she lay back against her pillow, with her mum's striped scarf wrapped around her neck. Had they imagined that strange thing in the wood? "Grandpa, I'm scared," blurted out Spencer, eyes like saucers. "Really? Of what?" Hetty knew that Spencer was about to get them both in trouble. "Oh, he just misses Mum and Dad." She threw in hastily and gave Spencer a look that meant, "Don't spill the beans or we'll both get it." Spencer shot back a look that said, "Don't butt in when I'm talking." But also fine, I won't say anything. Grandpa John didn't catch any of these glared messages as he absent-mindedly potted around the bedroom. "I'm sure Mum and Dad miss you too," he said. "Do they read to you before bed?" "I never did for your mother, maybe I should have." "What if I read you a story?" He plucked an old paperback from the shelf near the windows. "This book belonged to your grandmother," he murmured softly. A long, slow sigh escaped his chest, and he seemed to shrink into himself. "What was Grandma like?" Hetty asked. Grandpa John put the book back and picked up a pair of metal magician's rings, each about the circumference of a football. He began to deftly play with them, passing them through each other like magic. Neither Hetty nor Spencer could catch how he did it. "Everybody who met Rose loved her," Grandpa John said softly. "She was very quick to joke, very generous." "How did you meet her?" asked Hetty. The metal rings were now balancing steadily, impossibly on top of one another. I pulled her from the audience during a show." "Was she ever your assistant?" Grandpa John didn't reply. He was staring off into a place much further away than the walls of their bedroom. "Grandpa? Pardon my girl. What happened to Grandma?" The rings began to tremble, clinking and chattering against one another, until the top one tumbled down onto the floor. Grandpa John simply stared at it and said, "The magic went wrong." Spencer slid into the cave he had made of his duvet and pillow, scared but fascinated. Grandpa John bent to pick up the ring and continued softly. "I had a box for my show, a large one that hid things I made. The Kaleidos, I called it. It was brilliant, a showstopper. He smiled very briefly. But one night, the magic box went wrong. She was just gone. Grandpa John turned away from them, placing the magician's rings back on his shelf and then looking back closely at an old map on the wall. He blew his nose quietly into his handkerchief. Hetty sneaked a look at the photograph in her dressing gown pocket. The woman who looked like their own mother had to be their missing grandmother Rose. Grandpa, can you stay here until I fall asleep? Spencer said in a half whisper. But Hetty's right here. She's all the way over there though. As Grandpa John tucked Hetty's duvet around her, she noticed his eyes were a little watery. She tentatively hugged him. Are you okay, Grandpa? Grandpa John gave her a solemn wink, pulled up a chair beside Spencer and turned off the lamp. Hetty woke as she heard Grandpa John's footsteps leaving their room. She tried flipping the pillow over and covering her head with the duvet, but couldn't get back to sleep. Moonlight slipped into the room through the gap in the curtains, and Hetty finally threw back her covers and opened the trunk at the end of her bed. She pulled out a torch, and checking that the photograph of Grandmother Rose was in her pocket, hadn't crept out. She stole into the room next to theirs, closing the faded green door mostly, but not all the way, and picked up the scrapbook to flip through it. The first half was filled with newspaper clippings, cut-out advertisements and flyers for the shows of the amazing John Sang, magician. Sometimes a young Peter Sang was the opening act, and sometimes it was other magicians Hetty had never heard of. There was a magician who could cut off his own head. Gross, thought Hetty. One who seemed to pull a tiger out of a basket, and another who turned into an X-ray of himself. There were many photographs of Grandpa John, and some of Rose too. They looked happy. Hetty found the spot where the photograph in her pocket belonged and replaced it. As she went to return the scrapbook to its shelf, the faintest whisper seemed to drift next to her ear. Hetty spun around, suddenly remembering the bump in the floorboards. She didn't see anything moving, but her turn knocked a small table, and a large framed photograph wobbled. Hetty leant down to have a closer look with her torch. The glass of the frame was thick with dust, but Hetty could make out John, Rose, and a toddler. Her mum, she guessed, wearing party hats and blowing out candles on a birthday cake. As she stared at the photograph, words were spelt out in the dust, as if being drawn by an invisible finger. Find me. Okay, that is the end of chapter 2. House on Hoarder Hill, buy it now.
Thank you to Shack Artists and Shack Attack for this reading of The House on Hoarder Hill, read by me, CAIN FOWLER, Jenny Richardson and PADDY HOLLAND. We hope you enjoyed The House on Hoarder Hill and continue reading to solve the mystery.